The way, therefore, in which enlightenment apprehends its object in the first instance and generally is that it takes it as pure insight, and not recognizing itself therein, declares it to be error. In insight as such, consciousness apprehends an object in such a way that it becomes the essence of consciousness, or becomes an object which consciousness permeates, in which consciousness preserves itself, abides with itself, and remains present to itself. And since it is thus the movement of the object brings it into existence. It is just this that enlightenment rightly declares faith to be when it says that what is for faith the absolute being is a being of its own consciousness, is its own thought, something that is a creation of consciousness itself. Thus, what enlightenment declares to be an error and a fiction is the very same thing as enlightenment itself is. Enlightenment that wants to teach faith the new wisdom does not tell it anything new, for its object is also for it just this, that is, a pure essence of its own consciousness, so that this consciousness does not take itself to be lost and negated in that object, but rather puts its trust in it, that is, finds itself as this particular consciousness, or as self-consciousness, precisely in the object. Whomsoever I trust, his certainty of himself is for me the certainty of myself. I recognize in him my own being for self, know that he acknowledges it, and that it is for him purpose and essence. Trust, however, is faith, because the consciousness of the believer is directly related to its object and is thus also intuitively aware that it is one with it and in it. Further, since what is object for me is that in which I recognize myself, I am for myself at the same time in that object in the form of another self-consciousness, that is, one which has become in that object alienated from its particular individuality, that is, from its natural and contingent existence, but which partly remains therein self-consciousness, partly in that object is an essential consciousness, just as pure insight is. The notion of pure insight implies not merely that consciousness recognizes itself in the object of its insight and is immediately present in it without first leaving the element of thought and returning into itself. It also implies that consciousness is aware of itself as being also the mediating movement, aware of itself as being the activity of producing the object. This unity of itself as unity of self and object is thereby explicit for it in thought. Faith, too, is just this consciousness. Obedience and action form a necessary moment through which the certainty that absolute being is comes about. This action of faith does not indeed make it appear as if absolute being itself is produced by it, but the absolute being of faith is essentially not the abstract essence that would exist beyond the consciousness of the believer. On the contrary, it is the spirit of the religious community, the unity of the abstract essence and self-consciousness. That it be the spirit of the community, this requires as a necessary moment the action of the community. It is this spirit only by being produced by consciousness, or rather, it does not exist as the spirit of the community without having been produced by consciousness. For essential as is the producing of it, this is equally essentially not the sole ground of absolute being, but only a moment. Absolute being is at the same time in and for itself. Paragraph 549 is a very long one, and there's a lot going on here. I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb and say that the nexus or the kernel of it could be said to consist in one short statement. Of course, that's going to require a lot of unpacking, and that's what I have here in the middle, translated as trust, however, is faith. Vertrauen ist aber der Glauben. Actually sounds a little bit better in the German, a little bit poetic in some ways, right? Trust is faith. Now, why is that important? Because you could say that one of the things that's been going on all this time, that we saw faith starting to kick back against a little bit is insight and the Enlightenment dictating to faith, well, this is the way things are. Let me tell you, we might actually, if we want to, play off of contemporary language, we could call it Enlightenment-splaining, right? Sort of like mansplaining, the men tell women, well, by the way, feminism means this and that. That's what the Enlightenment does with faith. It tells faith, well, here's why you're in error, because you, of course, have just been engaging in this projection of consciousness outside of itself without realizing it. And that's irrational, and we're going to leave you behind eventually. Well, faith doesn't go away quite so easily because, as Hegel's going to point out, there's something like faith going on in Enlightenment as well. This is the dirty little secret of Enlightenment, isn't it? And there's more to say about this. This is a really important topic to come to. But let's take a look at the text. So he says, the way in which Enlightenment apprehends its object in the first instance, and generally, is that it takes it as pure insight, not recognizing itself therein, declares it to be error. So what's going on in insight? He says, in insight as such, consciousness apprehends its object, grasps its object, in such a way that it becomes the essence of consciousness. So it sort of takes it into consciousness. Or if you like, the object stays out there, but as Hegel says, it becomes permeated by consciousness. And why is it able to do that? Because consciousness is already there. We've seen this so many times already. Why is it that reason can extend to everything? Because reason is already out there and just needs to be brought back home to, we might say capital R reason, or the reason of the individual being. But the world is rational, and we can make sense of it. Consciousness can grasp its object because the object already is for consciousness. This is the way insight works. So he says, when it becomes an object that consciousness permeates, in this consciousness preserves itself, abides with itself, remains present to itself, and since it is thus the movement of the object, brings it into existence, makes it be what it is, gives it its importance, gives it its weight, its heft, its sense, its meaning. So this is a process that's going on all the time for insight. And the enlightened person is supposed to realize this, but isn't understanding this at this point in time. So notice what Hegel does here. He says, well, that's pretty similar to faith, isn't it? What does enlightenment say about faith? What does enlightenment explain to faith about itself? He says, enlightenment rightly declares faith to be something. And why is this rightly? Well, we've already seen this back with the unhappy consciousness and other manifestations of religion. This is part of the essence of faith, that it does project the absolute outside of itself and fail to realize that that is also consciousness projecting itself at the same time that it loses or negates itself in the absolute. It's really playing a sort of game. It's putting the absolute out there so it can run to meet it or pine away for its absence. But it's really itself that it's looking for. Faith is a form of consciousness. So he says enlightenment tells faith that the absolute being is a being of its own consciousness, something that's a creation of consciousness itself. That God, or even that non-God, if you want to be, a mystic or something like that, and say, there's a Godhead above God, or, it's emptiness, or, can't speak about it, or whatever. Well, that's still a projection of consciousness. And it's essentially, I don't want to say figment of your imagination, because that implies that we're still merely in the realm of picture thinking. And there's a certain depth to this, right? But it is coming, according to Hegel, through this process of projection. This, by the way, is something that Feuerbach and some of the other Hegelians, Marx, Stirner, they're going to pick up on this aspect of faith and say, well, that's really what all faith does, all religion does. This isn't where Hegel's going to end things, of course. But that is what the Enlightenment tells faith. So he goes on and he says, what Enlightenment declares to be an error and a fiction, when faith is doing it, what about when Enlightenment is doing the same damn thing? That's the critique here. That Enlightenment has to make of itself, and that faith is actually going to be the one generally to make it against Enlightenment, because Enlightenment might not be honest enough with itself about what it's doing. It's doing the same thing as faith. He says, what Enlightenment declares to be an error, a fiction, something created, is what Enlightenment is doing. Enlightenment that wants to teach faith this new wisdom doesn't tell it anything new. All it does is change the channel, change the flavor. You've got Enlightenment flavor, you've got faith flavor. One is not necessarily better than the other. But Enlightenment is giving itself airs as being fundamentally different. Now Hegel tells us something really interesting that's going to come to this crux, right? He says, Enlightenment's object is also for it just this, a pure essence of its own consciousness. Consciousness reaches out, creates its other, right, that it can exist in relation to. And he says, so that this consciousness does not take itself to be lost and negated in that object, but rather puts its trust in it. Or, literally just trusts it. Vertrauen is the verb that we get, vertrauen from here as the act of trusting. So he says, this is Hegel going on, it puts its trust in it. It finds itself as this particular consciousness or as self-consciousness precisely in the object. Now notice what he says next. Whomsoever I trust, his certainty of himself is for me the certainty of myself. Isn't that an interesting insight? Whoever I trust, his certainty of himself is my certainty of myself. There is a reciprocity there, an inextricable relation that offers the possibility not merely of reconciliation for consciousness, but of what? The recognition that consciousness as self-consciousness has been seeking this entire time. Everything finally comes together. Everybody is acknowledged, right? Everybody is known in who they are and knows themselves for who they are. Now we're getting a little utopian. We're getting a little bit beyond ourselves at this point. But it's good to have that in mind because that's driving this process, right? So he says, I recognize in this person who I trust my own being for self. Know that he acknowledges it and that it is for him purpose and essence. When I trust somebody, I'm counting on them. Those words purpose and essence are really important here. When I trust somebody, I'm counting on that person not just to do what they say, but if I really trust in them and I have this relation with them, I am trusting that they respect me as an end, as having ends, Zweck, right? That I choose purposes or set purposes for myself, and I'm not going to simply be deprived of these. Essence as well. What is important for me, what matters to me, also matters to them. They take it into account. They don't just say, oh, I fulfilled my contract, so screw you, you're on your own. If you really have this relationship of trust, there's something more going on there. So now he says, now this is very important, this is a very good thing. This is what the Enlightenment is supposed to be offering us. But now notice what Hegel says. Trust, however, is faith. Right? Why? Because the consciousness of the believer, the one who has faith, the one who believes, is directly related to its object, and is thus also intuitively aware that it is one with it and in it. The relationship of the religious believer to the absolute is not merely this self-abnegation, losing yourself. It is also a relationship of trust, very much like the one that has just been laid out here. It's just one that doesn't recognize that that's what's going on, any more than the Enlightenment necessarily recognizes what's going on. So he says, since what is object for me is that in which I recognize myself, I am for myself at the same time in that object in the form of another self-consciousness. There's a projection of self-consciousness into being the other. Now what we should do here, I think, is actually change object here to other. Other what? Other self. Self-consciousness. Right? What is object for me is that in which I recognize myself. I can only truly, as we know from the self-consciousness section, I can only truly recognize myself not just in a piece of chalk, not just in words on a chalkboard, but in an other. Somebody else. Somebody who I am related to in this relationship now of trust, which now we've seen to be a form of faith. So is what's going on in faith that much different than what's going on up here? Hegel's not actually telling you, yes, it's exactly the same. He's saying enlightenment is itself discovering this. First, it has to struggle against that, and it's not going to want to admit it for quite a while, but it is going to discover it. It's helped out by faith also pointing out, wait a second, the stuff that you guys criticize us for, aren't you doing that too? So that's also helpful. So he says, the object in the form of another self-consciousness, that is one which has become in that object alienated from the particular individuality, that is, from its natural and contingent existence, but which partly remains therein self-consciousness. In that object is an essential consciousness, just as pure insight is. This is the transcendence of the spiritual. It doesn't lose, of course, its body, its particularity as this person or that person, but it means more than that, and that's important. So he goes on and he says, the notion, the concept, the G.W.F of pure insight implies not merely that consciousness recognizes itself in the object of its insight and is immediately present in it without first leaving the element of thought and returning to itself. That all is happening, but consciousness is aware of itself as being the mediating movement, aware of itself as being the activity of producing the object. So there's again, to take the contrast between faith and enlightenment. Enlightenment is becoming fully conscious that it is producing this relationship. Faith, of course, is still in the dark about how this is actually working. It's sort of denigrating the human side of it for what is actually also the human side, but is much more projected as the eternal, the absolute, something greater than it. But they have the same structure here. The only difference is one of them knows what's going on, and the other one is somewhat confused about it. So he says this unity of itself is unity of self and object, is thereby explicit for it in thought. But now notice what Hegel says. Faith, too, is this consciousness. How so? We just said faith was confused about what's going on with it. Well, yes and no. Oops, erased it a little bit. What does faith do? Is faith merely a belief that projects something else out there? Or is faith active? I mean, this is something that theologians have given a lot of thought to. This goes all the way back to, letters talking about how one ought to behave in the early church. Think about Paul's letters. Think about James. Faith that doesn't actually do anything isn't real faith. So here Hegel talks about obedience and action. He says these form a necessary moment through which the certainty that absolute being is comes about. You're not really certain. You don't really have faith if you're not actually doing anything in relation to that absolute. Again, we see the importance of the practical over the merely speculative for Hegel. So he says, this action of faith doesn't make it appear as if the absolute being is produced by it, But the absolute being of faith, he says, is essentially not the abstract essence that would exist beyond the consciousness of the believer. So what is it? It's the spirit. This is very interesting. It's the spirit of the religious community. So what is being projected isn't just some object that's sitting out there. This is how this faith that Hegel's talking about is different from the unhappy consciousness. The religious community, this is prefiguring what is going to happen in the religion section and in the absolute knowing section. What is the religious community? The religious community is other people of faith who are conscious, who are other self-consciousnesses. Recognition, anerkennen, is happening not just through the Enlightenment, but also in the religious community. So he says it's the spirit of the religious community, the unity of the abstract essence and self-consciousness. Then he says, that it be the spirit of the community, this requires as a necessary moment the action of the community. It's not enough, and this is very interesting, it's not enough, you can't really have a community that's just people all believing the same thing, but nobody actually doing anything. You need rituals. You need a place to gather. Even if you're doing it virtually online, you're still needing some sort of corporeality, even if it's merely a virtual, visual one, in order to do that. I remember when I was a kid, and we didn't want to go to church on Sunday, we would try to talk my mom into accepting us sitting there and watching a show that was called Mass for Shut-ins. And we'd say, well, we could watch that, and it would be the same thing as going to Mass. And of course, she wasn't having anything of it. Instead, she'd say, that is indeed for shut-ins, for people who are stuck and can only participate through watching. And somebody will come and bring them communion. So there's again, corporeality, there's action going on. We were trying to say, the idea is good enough. And she was insisting, no. And she was right in Hegel's sense here, right? So he goes on and he says, it's this spirit only by being produced by consciousness, or rather it does not exist as the spirit of the community without having been produced by consciousness. It is human beings, according to Hegel, that make the religious community. It's not that God is there beforehand and then says, everybody get around, I'm going to give you a message. Okay, now you're a community, now do the things. No, there's a dialectic back and forth, and the human beings are really the ones involved in, essentially, from Hegel's perspective, creating that other, that absolute other who's out there, who then is recuperated into the community. So he says, for as essential as is the producing of it, this is equally, essentially, not the sole ground of absolute being, only a moment. Absolute being is at the same time in and for itself. So now we're going to have to see, great, what is absolute being? How does that enter in here? And now we've also a little bit lost the thread. What just happened to enlightenment here? Is enlightenment being left behind because now we're talking about faith and the religious community? Or are we going to come back to it? Again, trust, however, is faith. So there's something like faith going on in both of these. And there's the kind of trust that we find in enlightenment permeating the religious community, the functioning religious community, not the dysfunctional religious community as well.